The envelope has been in my coat pocket for 43 years. I have taken it out perhaps 1,000 times. In the dark, with a flashlight, under the blankets when my husband was sleeping. In the bathroom at 3 in the morning. In the queue at the bread shop when I thought no one was looking. I have held it up to light. I have felt the paper through the envelope. I have pressed it against my chest, like something alive, like something that still needed warmth. Today, I am going to mail it. My name is Natalia Sorokina. I was born in Saratov in 1921. I was 22 years old when I went to Stalingrad, and I was carrying a medical kit that was too heavy for my shoulders, and a fear that I had not yet learned to name. This is the story I have never told anyone. Not my mother, not my husband, God rest him, not my children, not my colleagues at the hospital where I worked for 31 years. There were moments, over 4 decades, when the words came so close to the surface that I could feel them pressing against the inside of my teeth. And then something would happen, a sound, a look, the wrong kind of silence, and I would swallow them back down. And the letter would stay where it was, in the lining of my coat, in the box under the floorboard, in the drawer behind the false back I built with a kitchen knife and 3 weeks of patience. I am 66 years old. My hands shake slightly now. The envelope is yellowed at the corners, and I am going to tell you everything from the beginning, because I am tired of carrying this alone. They sent me to Stalingrad in November of 1942. I was not a soldier. I was a nurse, trained in 18 months at the Saratov Medical Institute, which had compressed 4 years of curriculum into a year and a half, because there was not, as our instructors kept reminding us, time. There was never time in those years. Time was the one thing the war had confiscated entirely. The train journey took 4 days. I remember the cold pressing in through the walls of the carriage, like something deliberate. The other nurses on the train were quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are afraid and have decided not to show it. We played cards. We slept. We looked out the window at the flat white land moving past and said nothing about where we were going. Stalingrad was not, by the time I arrived, a city. It was a lesson in what happens when 2 ideas about the world decide to resolve their disagreement on the same ground at the same time, with everything available to them. The medical station where I was assigned was in the basement of what had once been a factory. Above us, the building still existed in pieces, walls without ceilings, floors without walls, a staircase leading up to open sky. Below us, 43 beds, 2 operating tables, 3 surgeons who had not slept in the way a normal person sleeps in weeks. My job was to keep people from dying. My success rate in those first weeks was not something I allowed myself to calculate. There are things that medicine trains you for, and things that nothing trains you for. I had studied anatomy. I knew how the body was assembled, the logic of it, the beautiful, terrible logic of bones and vessels and organs, arranged in a system that was, under normal circumstances, extraordinarily difficult to damage permanently. War had decided to make normal circumstances irrelevant. I learned, in Stalingrad, that you can function on 2 hours of sleep, that your hands can remain steady when the rest of you is shaking, that there is a part of the mind that is capable of pure mechanical operation, that can assess and act and move on to the next without stopping to feel, and that this part of the mind is a mercy and also a wound you will carry for a long time after. I learned that you do not get used to it. You simply get faster. The men came in on stretchers, on doors, on other men's backs. Some of them were talking. Some of them were not. I learned to know, very quickly, from the sound and the look, which ones we might save and which ones we could only make comfortable. I learned the particular silence of a man who has already made peace with his situation. I learned the particular noise of a man who has not. I was 22 years old. There was a boy from Smolensk named Petya, who was 19 and had been a baker's apprentice before the war. He came in one evening with a wound that was not in itself unsurvivable. But by the time he arrived, he had lost too much, and we had too little. And I held his hand while he died, and he talked about bread, not about the war, not about his mother, about the smell of bread in the morning, and the weight of the dough, and the way the crust cracked when you tapped it just right. He talked about bread until he couldn't anymore. I am telling you this because I want you to understand what kind of person I was, and what kind of world I was living in when I found Kurt Brenner. I was a person who had held Petya's hand while he talked about bread. I was a person who had learned to say goodbye to men I would never know. I was a person who had been made, by 3 months in that basement, into something both harder and more tender than the girl from Saratov who had arrived on the train in November. I want you to understand something about who I was before I tell you what I did. I was a girl from Saratov who had grown up believing in things, in order, in the Soviet state and what it meant, in right and wrong, which were, I believed then, relatively clear categories. I had a photograph of my mother in my coat pocket, and a small icon of the Virgin, which I kept hidden because we had been told that these things were incompatible with correct thinking, and which I was not prepared to give up. I believed in right and wrong, and then I found him. It was February. The battle for the city was in its final phase. The German 6th Army had been encircled for weeks. The city was a frozen ruin, and in the basement of a bombed building, 2 streets from our station, between a collapsed section of wall and a broken pipe that was still somehow releasing steam, I found a German soldier. He was alive, barely. He was perhaps 24, 25. Fair-haired, under the grime. His uniform was Wehrmacht. His eyes were open, and he was looking at me with an expression that I can only describe as resigned, not afraid, resigned. The way a man looks when he has already accepted the worst and is simply waiting to find out which form it takes. I stood there, in the cold, with my medical kit on my shoulder. I knew what I was supposed to do. Every protocol, every instruction, every word of Soviet medical training said the same thing. German soldiers were the enemy. The enemy was to be reported to command, or left where they were. You did not use Soviet medical supplies on German soldiers when Soviet soldiers were dying for lack of those same supplies. The logic was iron. I stood there for what felt like a very long time. He said something in German. I did not speak German, but I understood the tone. It was not a threat. It was not a demand. It was a statement, very quiet, that sounded like, I know what is going to happen. I am not afraid. You can go. I did not go. I do not know, even now, why I did it. I have spent 43 years asking myself that question. Not with guilt. I passed through guilt long ago, out the other side, into something else, something harder to name. I ask it the way you ask a question about mathematics. Why did the thing happen the way it happened? What was the mechanism? The best answer I have found is this. He looked like my brother. Not truly. My brother Alexei was dark-haired and stocky and had a gap between his front teeth that made him look younger than he was. This man looked nothing like him, but there was something, an arrangement of the features, a quality of the stillness that made the word brother move through me like a current before I could stop it. And once that word had moved through me, I could not unknow it. I knelt down, I opened my kit. I worked by touch more than sight, in the half-dark, with my back to the street in case anyone passed. He did not make a sound. His self-control was extraordinary for a man in that amount of pain. Once, his hand found my wrist, not grabbing, just resting, and stayed there for a moment, and then fell away. I could not bring him to the station. That was impossible. So I brought the station to him, in pieces, over the next 3 nights. You want to know the specific terror of what I did? The terror was not the German. The terror was the mathematics. Every time I took a bandage for him, that was 1 fewer bandage for a Soviet soldier. Every dose of the sulfa powder we had very little, was a calculation. Every visit to that basement was a lie told to 3 or 4 people about where I was going and why. Every minute I spent with him was a minute I was not at my station, where my hands were needed. I made the calculation every time, and I kept going back. On the second night, he was conscious enough to talk. He spoke no Russian. I spoke no German. We communicated in the way that people have always communicated when language fails, with hands, with expressions, with the universal vocabulary of 2 human beings in a cold, dark room, trying to understand each other. He pointed to himself. "Kurt," he said. I pointed to myself. "Natalia," he repeated it carefully. "Natalia," as if it were something worth getting right. We sat in silence for a while after that. It sounds strange, I know. Silence between 2 people who could not speak to each other. But it was not an empty silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when 2 people have stopped pretending that words are the main thing. He was in pain, and he was cold, and he was far from home, and he was going to die. And he knew it, and I knew it. And for an hour we simply existed in the same small circle of lantern light and did not try to make that into anything else. There is a kind of company that requires no language. I had not known this before Stalingrad. I know it now. Over the 3 nights I treated him, I learned the following things about Kurt Brenner of Munich. He had been a school teacher before the war. Mathematics, he indicated, drawing equations in the dust with his finger, then shaking his head with an expression that meant, and then this happened instead. He had a dog named Bruno, which he conveyed through an elaborate pantomime that made me laugh despite everything. A real laugh, the first in weeks, surfacing from somewhere I had thought was closed off entirely. On the 3rd night, when he was stronger, he tried to tell me more. He drew a chalkboard in the air with 1 finger. I understood, a classroom. He counted children on his fingers, pointing to imaginary desks around the basement as if positioning students. 10, 12, 15. He had a particular way of explaining something. I could see it even in pantomime, the patience of a man accustomed to waiting for understanding to arrive at its own pace. He was a good teacher. I knew this without needing words to tell me. He drew a window in the air, then a mountain outside it. "Munich," he said again. And then he drew something that took me a moment to understand. A bicycle, and a road, and someone riding, him, before. He shook his head slowly and looked at his hands, and I understood. He was trying to remember what it had felt like to be the person who rode that bicycle, the person who stood in front of the classroom, the person who came home to Elise in the evenings, and the dog, and the garden. That person felt very far away. I could see it on his face. The distance between here and there had become uncrossable, and he had a wife. Her name was Elise. He said it carefully. The first night he was well enough to speak more than a few words. Elise. And then he reached inside his coat, slowly, watching my face to make sure I understood he was reaching for paper and not anything else, and brought out a photograph. She was beautiful. Dark-eyed, serious, standing in what looked like a garden in summer. She was squinting slightly against the light, and there was half a smile, as if someone had said something just before the photograph was taken that she had not quite decided whether to find funny. He held the photograph for a long time. Then he put it back, very carefully, in the inside pocket of his coat, against his heart. The gesture was so simple and so precise that I had to look away. On the 3rd night, he gave me the letter. He had written it during the day, I understood. He had been conscious and alone, and he had written it in a small notebook he carried. And now he had torn out the pages and folded them and sealed them, and on the outside he had written an address, Munich, a street name I could not read, and the name, Elise Brenner. He held it out to me with both hands. And then he said something in German, several sentences, looking at me very steadily, and I did not understand the words, but I understood completely what he was asking. If something happens to me, find a way, Send this." I held the letter in my hands. I want to tell you what I knew in that moment. I knew that I was holding an enemy communication. I knew that I was in possession of a document I was legally required to turn over to my commanding officer. I knew that if I was found with it, the questions would not stop at the letter. They would continue backward, to the basement, to the 3 nights, to every bandage and every dose of sulfa powder. They would continue to a conclusion that I did not allow myself to think about directly. I knew all of this. I put the letter in my coat pocket. He died that night. I came back the next morning, and he was gone. Not gone. He was still there, but the thing that had been Kurt Brenner of Munich was no longer present. What remained was just a body, in a German uniform, in a cold basement, which was a very different thing. I stood there for a long time. I did not cry. I want to be honest about this. I did not cry, not then. The part of my mind that could cry had been given a job to do, and it was doing it. I stood there, and I looked at him, and I thought, I never told him that I understood about the dog, about the equations, about the garden in summer. I thought, he died thinking I might not send it. I buttoned my coat. I walked back to the station, and the letter went with me. The battle ended in February. The encirclement was complete. I was reassigned in March to a field hospital further west, and then further west again, following the line as it moved. I worked until August of 1945. I treated, by my rough count, something over 3,000 men. I lost count of the ones who died. I came home to Saratov in September of 1945. My mother met me at the station. She was smaller than I remembered, or I was larger. Something had shifted in the proportions of everything. We stood on the platform and held each other for a long time, and neither of us spoke, and that was the right thing. I had the letter. It was in the lining of my coat now. I had opened the seam with a needle in a quiet moment somewhere near Kursk, and slid the letter inside and sewn it closed again. The stitches were uneven. I had always been better with a patient than with a needle. I want to tell you about the world I came home to, and why the letter stayed where it was. This is the part that is the hardest to explain to someone who did not live it. In 1945, in the Soviet Union, you did not write to Germany. Germany was the enemy. The enemy was the thing that had just taken 27 million Soviet lives. The political climate was not a metaphor. It was a specific, textured, daily reality. It was the way certain conversations stopped when you walked into a room. It was the colleague who disappeared between Tuesday and Thursday with no explanation offered or requested. It was the knock on the door at 3 in the morning that everyone knew about and no one mentioned. The letter was a German letter, to a German address, from a Soviet nurse who had, in a basement in Stalingrad, committed what could be interpreted as aid to the enemy. I was not a coward. I want to say that clearly. I had spent 3 years in places that removed all ambiguity about what cowardice was and was not. I was not a coward, but I was not stupid, so the letter stayed in the lining of my coat. And then, when the coat wore out, I transferred it to a small tin box that had once held tea. And when I married Dmitri in 1949, a good man, a quiet man, an engineer who never asked me what I had seen in the war, because he understood that there are questions you do not ask. The tin box came with me and lived under the floorboard in our bedroom, beneath a corner of the rug that Dmitri never happened to lift. He never knew. Let me tell you about the moments, over the years, when I came close. In 1953, Stalin died. I remember standing in the kitchen of our apartment in Saratov, listening to the radio and thinking, perhaps now, perhaps the world has shifted enough. I took the tin box out from under the floorboard that evening and held it for a long time. And then I thought about what now actually meant. The party was still the party, the security apparatus was still the apparatus, and a Soviet nurse corresponding with a German widow about a wartime secret was still, in 1953, a Soviet nurse corresponding with a German widow about a wartime secret. The box went back under the floor. In 1961, the wall went up in Berlin. The world, it seemed, was not moving toward openness. It was moving in the opposite direction. That year, I almost threw the letter away, not from fear, from something darker, from the sense that the world in which the letter could safely travel did not exist and was not going to exist, and that keeping it was a form of hope I could no longer afford. I took it out of the box and held it over the kitchen sink. My hand did not move. I put it back. In 1975, on the 30th anniversary of the end of the war, there were ceremonies and speeches and medals for surviving veterans. My own service was acknowledged, a small certificate, a handshake from a local official. That evening I sat with the tin box on the table, and I looked at it and I thought, Kurt has been dead for 32 years. Elise, if she is alive, has been waiting for 32 years, and I have done nothing. The guilt of that anniversary was specific and heavy, in a way the ordinary years were not. I put the box away. I kept going. I want to tell you what it is like to carry something for 40 years. It is not dramatic. That is the first thing. It is not a constant weight pressing on you, dramatic and cinematic and heavy. It is more like a stone in your shoe, worn smooth. You know it is there. You feel it when you walk certain ways. And then days go by when you forget it entirely, and then something happens, a word, a photograph, a certain quality of winter light, and it is there again, as present as if you had just this moment put it in your pocket. I thought about Elise Brenner, perhaps, 3 or 4 times a year. I wondered if she was alive. I wondered if she had remarried, as so many women did. German losses in that war were catastrophic. The mathematics of it brutal. A generation of women left waiting for men who were not coming back. I wondered if she had children. I wondered if she had spent the years the way I had, with a portion of herself held in reserve, waiting for a word that never came. I worked. I raised 2 children, a son and a daughter, both healthy, both, thankfully, born into a world where they would not be sent to Stalingrad at 22. I buried Dmitri in 1979. I kept working. I was a good nurse. My colleagues trusted me. My patients sometimes wrote to me afterward. And every year, on the 14th of February, not because of any Western custom, but because that was the date he died, the date I had noted in my mind like a mark on a wall. I took out the tin box, and I held the letter, and I thought about a man I had known for 3 nights in a basement in Stalingrad 40 years ago. In 1987, something shifted. Gorbachev had been speaking for 2 years about glasnost, openness. The word moved through Soviet society the way light moves through a room when someone opens a curtain, slowly at first, in thin strips, and then more. And then you remember what a room looks like with the curtains open, and you cannot understand how you lived so long in the dimness. I am not going to pretend that I sent the letter because of political philosophy. I sent the letter because I was 66 years old, because my hands had started to shake slightly, and I was aware, in the specific way that older people become aware, of the arithmetic of remaining time. Because Dmitri was gone, and my children were grown, and I was sitting in my apartment in Moscow on a February evening with the tin box open on the table, and I thought, if I die with this letter, it will have gone nowhere. All those years, all that wait, and it will have meant nothing except a secret kept for no reason by a dead woman in a city that Elise Brenner had never heard of, about a husband who had died 44 years ago in a basement that no longer existed. I could not bear it. The address on the envelope was 44 years old. Munich had been bombed. Munich had been occupied. Munich had been rebuilt. A street address from 1943 might mean anything or nothing. The building might be gone. The family might have moved, scattered, disappeared into the general dislocation of a country that had lost a war and been divided and remade. I wrote to the Munich City Records Office. It took me 3 drafts. My German was elementary. I had taught myself, quietly over the years, not well, but enough to read and write simple sentences. I explained that I was trying to locate the family of a man named Kurt Brenner, born approximately 1918 or 1919, a school teacher, resident of Munich before the war. I explained that I had a letter for his wife, Elise. I gave the old address. I did not explain who I was or why I had the letter. Some things you say in person or not at all. I mailed the request on a Tuesday in March, and then I waited. The wait was 6 weeks. 6 weeks is not a long time, measured against 44 years. I understand this mathematically, but the waiting, after the decision to act, is a specific kind of wait. Every day the mechanism continued without result was a day in which the possible outcomes multiplied. She was dead. Of course she was dead. She would be in her late 60s, early 70s if she was alive, and people died. She had moved and left no forwarding address. The building was gone, the records destroyed, the family dispersed. I went to work, I ate, I slept. I took the tin box out less than usual because the waiting had made it more present, not less. And there is only so much of that a person can manage while also performing the ordinary operations of a life. I developed rituals during those 6 weeks. I checked the mailbox twice a day, once in the morning before work, and once in the afternoon when I returned. Even though the post only came once, I noted the postman's schedule. I began to recognize the texture of each day's delivery by weight before I even opened the box. I told myself each morning that I was prepared for silence, for no reply, for the possibility that the trail ended in Munich in 1943 and nowhere else. I was not prepared. The rituals were the opposite of preparation. They were a form of hope I could not suppress. And hope, after 44 years of suppressing it, was very difficult to manage. And then the reply came. It was a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because I had a hospital shift that ended at 2 in the afternoon, and I came home on the tram, and I was thinking about what to make for dinner, and I opened my mailbox in the lobby, and there was an envelope with a Munich postmark. I stood in the lobby for a long time. My neighbor passed through and said good afternoon, and I said good afternoon, and she went upstairs, and I stood in the lobby with the envelope in my hands. I went upstairs. I sat down at my kitchen table. I made tea, and then I opened it. The letter was in German, 4 pages, in handwriting that was careful and clear and slightly formal. The handwriting of a woman who had been taught, as I had, that letters were to be taken seriously. Her name was Elise Brenner. She was 67 years old. She had never remarried. She was living in the house, on the same street in Munich where Kurt had lived before the war. She had stayed because she could not bring herself to leave a place where she might still, somehow, receive news. She had waited 67 years old in the same house for news that never came until now. I want to tell you how I read that letter. I read the first line, and then I put it down and picked up my cup of tea, which had gone cold, and drank from it anyway, and then I picked up the letter again. I read the second line, and a sound came out of me that I do not have a word for. Not crying, not laughing, something between the two that has no name in any language I know. I read slowly. My dictionary was open on the table beside me, and I used it often, running my finger down columns of words until I found what I needed. The reading took a long time. I was in no hurry. I had waited 44 years. I could wait another hour. She thanked me. She used the word thank you in a way that had weight to it, that was not automatic courtesy but something harder earned, something that had taken her several attempts to write correctly. She thanked me for keeping it. She thanked me for finding her. She told me that she had always known Kurt was dead, not because of an official notification. Those had been chaotic, unreliable. Many German families never received formal word about what happened in the encirclement. She had known because of a feeling, the specific silence of a man who was no longer in the world, which she described in a phrase I have never forgotten. the absence of his weight on the other side of things. She had his letter now. She had read it many times already, in the 3 days since the records office had forwarded my address, and she had sat down to write. She told me some of what it contained, not all of it. Some things are private, some things are for a wife and no one else. But she told me that he had written about the garden in summer. He had written about Bruno. He had written that if she was reading this, then at least she would know he was thinking of her at the end, clearly and without fear, the way he had always tried to think about the things that mattered. And he had written one other thing. He had written that a Soviet nurse had found him, that she had helped him, that she had kindness in her hands, he had written, which was how he described it, kindness in her hands, and that he hoped, somehow, she would find a way to send this. He had believed I would send it. He had died believing I would send it. I am standing at the post office now. I mailed Elise a second letter 3 weeks ago, with a longer explanation, who I was, what I had done, the basement, the 3 nights, the 44 years. She wrote back, "We are writing to each other now, carefully, in a mixture of my elementary German and her elementary Russian. 2 old women in 2 cold countries, finding the words." She sent me a photograph of the garden in summer. I recognized it immediately. I want to tell you, now at the end of this, what I have learned about carrying something for 40 years. Not the politics of it, not the history, the human part. The thing I carried was not a letter. The letter was paper. What I carried was a man's last act of love, folded and sealed and entrusted to a stranger, in a basement, in the worst city, in the worst winter of the worst war in human history. What I carried was his certainty that she would want to know. What I carried was his faith that the world contained, somewhere, enough decency to get a letter from Stalingrad to Munich. He was right. It took 44 years. But he was right. Sometimes I think about what I would say to the 22-year-old girl in that basement, if I could go back. Not to warn her. I would not change what she did, but perhaps just to tell her, you are going to carry this for a very long time. It is going to be heavy in ways you cannot predict, and you are going to be all right. The carrying is going to make you into someone you would not otherwise have been. And someday, on a Thursday in spring, a letter is going to arrive from Munich, and it will have been worth it. I think she would have put the letter in her pocket anyway, even knowing. Some things you carry because you have no choice, and some things you carry because you choose to, because the alternative is to be the person who walked away from that basement without kneeling down. And that person, I was quite certain, was not who I wanted to be. There is a thing I have thought about over the decades, something that has changed in its meaning as I have gotten older. When I was young, I thought the moral of what happened was about courage, about doing the right thing even at cost. And perhaps that is part of it. But I think the deeper thing is this, that in the worst circumstances human beings have ever constructed for themselves, in the cold and the rubble and the total failure of every system meant to organize human life, in the basement of a bombed building in Stalingrad in February, when the temperature was 30 below, 2 people who were supposed to be enemies managed to be, for 3 nights, simply human. He gave me a letter. I kept it. That is all. That is everything. I walked out of the post office into the Moscow spring. The linden trees were beginning to show green, the first tentative green of a Russian April. Always a little unbelievable, always a surprise. I had nothing in my coat pocket. For the first time in 44 years, I had nothing in my coat pocket. I stood on the pavement and breathed in and breathed out, and I was, improbably, lighter.